and here is a synopsis of my autobiography. I want to say hello everybody, welcome, and thank you to all my subscribers and those watching my new YouTube channel. First of all, please feel free to visit my website where you'll see a trailer of my autobiography, White Zulu. It's www.whitezulubook.com. That site includes many photographs as well. Incidentally, after undergoing a huge amount of stress recently, 2 of my bottom teeth at the back have sheared off, and this has affected my speech. So if I sound a bit lispy, that's the reason. I'm a published author, having written the first half of my autobiography. It's called White Zulu and describes my unusual upbringing right up to the age of 21. Born in 1950, I lived on a remote 5,000-acre cattle and sheep ranch in the foothills of the Drakensberg Mountains in what was then the Natal Midlands and became KwaZulu-Natal in 1994 in South Africa. My parents wanted sons, but were cursed, in their eyes, with 4 daughters instead. As each girl arrived, our mother handed us over to Zulu nannies to raise and returned to her real passion, gardening and stalking baboons. Living among Zulus, speaking only Zulu, we learnt their folklore, traditions, tracking game, and the use of plants in witchcraft and healing. I also met a Nomsango, a witch doctor. By age 12, I could drive a jeep, fly a small plane, ride any horse, play polo, read encyclopedias and dictionaries, but it had no formal schooling whatsoever. There are plenty of stories of my Zulu friends, the snakes, the animals, and my ponies, all of which took precedence in my life before I was hauled off to boarding school at the age of 12. It took me 11 years to write White Zulu alone. Suddenly, age 12, I was forcibly civilized, had to put on shoes, and was packed off to a strict girls' boarding school called St. Anne's Diocesan College in Hilton, overlooking Pietermaritzburg. I was incarcerated there for 6 wretched years, but instead of applying myself to schoolwork, I spent the entire 6 years fooling around, entertaining my schoolmates, and reading the entire collection of books in our library twice over. I was given the affectionate nickname Prof, short for Professor, not as a result of my academic achievements, but because I always had my nose in a library book. By some miracle, I passed my matric, but was not allowed to attend university. In my father's words, "Those places are full of communists," he'd say darkly, just because there had been a few protests against apartheid there at the time. Nor was I allowed to study veterinary science at Onderstepoort in Pretoria. It's full of Afrikaners, equally darkly. Instead, like my 3 sisters who'd all dropped out of school in Standard 9, I was sent to a finishing school in Switzerland, ostensibly to learn French cordon bleu cookery and skiing, while instead I was fraternizing with ski instructors, Italian waiters, and cavorting drunkenly in the ornamental fountains surrounding Lake Geneva, all at vast eye-watering expense to my parents. Then, in Durban, aged 19, I met a shy Scot heir to a castle. His parents strongly disapproved of the match, but nonetheless, we married, and moved to Glencruiton Castle in Scotland. There is a sequel to White Zulus called Zulu Mists, which follows on directly from the end of White Zulu, describing my arrival at Glencruiton, overlooking Oban Bay, on the west coast of the Scottish Highlands. We used to call it the wet coast. The contrast between my carefree, barefoot days in South Africa and the constraints of living with my frosty in-laws in the bleak and equally frosty conditions of the Scottish winter is very marked. There is a second book already completed called Okavango Diary, awaiting publication. This describes a time in my life when I was running 2 luxury tourist camps in the heart of the Okavango Delta in Botswana, a neighboring country in southern Africa. I was employed as relief camp manager along with 2 other white staff members and ran both lodges, only accessible by 4-seater aircraft, accommodating 16 guests at a time, and had a fairly large staff of river bushmen employed from the local tribe there. My job was to keep the guests, mainly from America, Australia, Japan, Europe and the UK, comfortable, well-fed and safe, while making sure the staff did their jobs. Throughout this, I had to keep all the wild animals from making themselves too much at home in the unfenced camps. Okavango's diary started off as weekly letters home to my family, describing daily incidents that happened. They enjoyed them so much that they suggested I make them into a book. I've also completed a children's book called Dusty, the Bushfelt Bear, which is narrated by my 70-year-old teddy bear, Dusty, who's featured with me on the home page of my website. This is a collection of short stories narrated by him and describes all the parts that I didn't put into White Zulu. This and all my subsequent children's books were to be translated into Zulu, as there is a big demand for children's books in Zulu in South Africa. But the COVID lockdown put my publishers out of business, and none of my other autobiographical books have been published. My last planned book will be called Crow Diary and will consist of short stories again, this time describing my career as a wildlife veterinary nurse living and working in a centre for rehabilitation of wildlife, hand-rearing all kinds of animals, from mongooses to monkeys to a 2-week-old white rhino calf. I also nursed and took care of mammals, reptiles and birds of every species imaginable back in 1997. Back in 1988, I fell seriously ill with viral encephalitis and contracted post-viral fatigue syndrome. While in remission, I contracted rickettsia, otherwise known as tick bite fever, 3 times in a row, as my hobby then was bird watching, hiking, and mountain biking. The final blow was in 1997, when I contracted bilharzia in the Okavango Delta while working as bush camp manager there. I became seriously ill and incapacitated with ME, myalgic encephalomyelitis. It's exactly like chronic fatigue syndrome or yuppie flu, although we don't care for those names because it's neither flu nor is it constricted to yuppies. It's a debilitating disease, a total mystery to the medical profession, but it's been suggested that my autoimmune system, whereby my immune system is constantly attacking my own body, is related to the polio virus. Otherwise, nothing else is known about this disease. Since I had been left penniless and homeless by my second husband, in order to keep a roof over my head, I created a business house sitting in the Plettenberg Bay area. At that time, in late 1997, my only home was a Series 1 Land Rover, a gift from a friend, and in which I lived, in between looking after my clients' homes. I'd have to park it as close to the beach as possible, because the sand dunes are where the bosslappers camped out, living hidden among the Jackson willows growing there. It was a terrifying experience, as none of the doors in that decrepit, rusty old vehicle locked, and the windows were so loose they were easy to slide open. I spent 3 years living like that. As my health deteriorated rapidly, I became so weak and disabled from the ME that on my birthday, at the end of January 1999, I drove my Landy to the Robberg at Plettenberg Bay, got out and stood on the cliff edge. I felt that only one small step forward to fall to my death onto the sharp boulders below, with massive waves crashing over them, would be the only solution to all the pain, migraines, creeping paralysis, and other horrible symptoms of ME. Also, I wouldn't be a burden to both my sons for any longer. I must have stood there for well over an hour as tourist coaches came and went. Nobody noticed this strange, shabbily dressed 50-year-old woman standing still on the cliff edge, staring down into the abyss at her feet. Eventually, something in my head made me step back, climb wearily into my Land Rover, and drive laboriously to my next client. Through the ME Association, I had met and made several pen pals, including an Englishman called Alan Timms. We began a correspondence, and in June 1999, he came over to South Africa, met me, and flew me back to live in England as his wife. We were married in 2002. In spite of the fact that I was married to an Englishman, it took me 4 years to acquire my British citizenship, and involved being kicked out of the UK every 6 months to winter in Plettenberg Bay, then returning to England for another 6 months of winter again. Since Alan wisely didn't want to relinquish his British citizenship and take up South African citizenship, he had to lock his house up for 6 months each time and travel with me. After 4 years of constantly flying back and forth between England and South Africa, I finally became a British citizen in 2004. The marriage lasted for 12 years. I became so ill and incapacitated that Alan no longer wanted me as his wife, began to bully me, and so I left him in March 2012. Again, I was homeless. After 5 years living a lonely, isolated life in a tiny bungalow, I was evicted as my landlord wanted to sell his house, and I moved to a sheltered housing unit for pensioners and the severely disabled, here in a small market town called Wisbech, near Cambridge in East Anglia. Here I'm now blissfully happy, living in my own little flat and surrounded by mostly highly eccentric, slightly demented, and other colourful fellow residents. I stay in bed for 20 hours out of 24 and have two wonderful carers for 4 hours a day, 2 hours in the morning and two again at night. Although I'm a bed-bound paraplegic with only one working arm, my right one, with which I do all my typing, I also use a voice recognition software to do all my writing. I do occasionally manage to get out. Sorry, if you hear that noise overhead, it's fighter jets. We're in the direct range of the bombing. We're in the direct line of the bombing range from all the air bases here. There are a whole lot of RAF air bases occupied by mainly American, with all the fighter jets you can think of. And they fly just over our chimney pots to the bombing range. It does get in the way of my recording, but that's what it is when you hear that noise. I do occasionally manage to get out, thanks to a wheelchair, a carer, and my car. I do feel safe in this country, but I'm constantly homesick for my beloved mother country, South Africa. The climate here is dismal, and I miss the bird life, the bush, and especially my fellow South Africans constantly. Further information and plenty of photos can be found on my website, www.whitezulubook.com. Thank you so much for listening to my story, and I will see you very, very soon with the first chapter of my autobiography, White Zulu. Goodbye. Thank you for listening, and take care. Stay safe. Bye-bye.